Todd Blanche. Some of the reporters with which you had close relationships were Chris Cuomo, Michael Cohen. Yes. Todd Blanche. Katy Tur, Michael Cohen. Yes. Let me just interject this comment at this moment. Every day I struggle with these, particularly with choosing the lead, because often the most important story is the most interesting story, but not always. Like yesterday, like this edition, this is not the most important story. Nevertheless, Adam Klasfeld reporting from the courthouse, quote, Cohen says he had a strong professional relationship with Chris Cuomo, Katy Tur, and Maggie Haberman. Kyle Cheney reporting from the courthouse, quote, Cohen also name-checked Chris Cuomo and Katy Tur. Hugo Lowell reporting from the courthouse, quote, Katy Tur, drink. Well, let's not force me to start that again. That's what I get for telling you that I would soon stop talking about my exes. Actually, I find myself in a very strange position here. Tur and Maggie Haberman and Chris Cuomo actually have to be defended somewhat. Trump's lawyer did ask Trump's ex-lawyer if he had close relationships with those three, including my ex. And Trump's ex-lawyer did say yes, but, and we'll know this with certainty later today when the official transcript of yesterday's testimony comes out, the most widely circulated thing supposedly testified to about Katy Tur and Haberman and Cuomo, and at least I never lived with Haberman or Cuomo, the most widely circulated supposed quote was not said. Ron Filipkowski of Midas Network, usually extremely reliable, got it wrong. Tried to correct it long after the horse was out of the barn. He and he alone wrote that, quote, Cohen testified that his main media contacts to get positive stories run about Trump were, you know. The clear implication in that quote is that when Trump needed good press, Cohen would first call Maggie Haberman, then Katy Tur, then Chris Cuomo, and that is not what he said. He only said he had good relationships with them. Is that a distinction without a difference? If Michael Cohen testified or believed or comes back when court goes back into session next Monday and says, I knew I could get Trump positive stories from the New York Times by calling Haberman, or I knew I could get Trump positive stories from CNN by calling Cuomo, or I knew I could get Trump positive stories from NBC by calling Tur, those guys are in the fireable offense zone. Those guys are in the your career is over zone. Those guys are in the what's your second act going to be zone. But they're not there now. Not that they might not get there, but they are not there now. They are to be viewed dubiously because what Cohen did say is damaging enough, but he never said these were the three people I called first to carry my water for me. He was asked about three people by name, and he said yes to all three. It doesn't mean those were his only three or his first three. Filipkowski really screwed this up. To his credit, he killed his tweet. He reached out to at least me, who had sent out a screenshot of his tweet, and said I should take it down too, and he was right. And I know the New York Times reached out to Filipkowski about the implications for Haberman. The problem for all three, of course, is the context. CNN fired Chris Cuomo after a disastrous journalistic fail in which he consulted for his brother on how to get away with the scandal that would ultimately cost his brother his governorship. More importantly, CNN fired Cuomo because his coverage of his brother's scandal was utterly indefensible. You do not say, I can remain impartial by not covering my brother, the governor. You do say I can remain impartial because when we should cover my brother, the governor, I will hand the newscast off to one of my colleagues and I will stay out of it. I mean, I was asked by CNN and Cuomo's executive producer in real time how to do this, and that's what I told them to do, and they ignored me and everybody got fired. Simply saying I won't cover his story just serves to reduce the amount of negative coverage of his story. It's not neutral in any way, shape, or form. Anyway, after Cuomo got fired, he went to News Nation, where he's become a bitter reactionary. He was never seen as particularly smart, either at CNN or at the job before that at ABC News, but now he's just another right-winger with no ratings. The last thing he needed was for Michael Cohen to say he had a close relationship with him. As to Haberman, she has been successfully skating on thin ice for years now, so I doubt the New York Times sees her in any worse a light today than it did this time yesterday. The Times, as I think most news organizations in trouble do, always becomes defiant when challenged. We're the Times. The Times defended a guy named Jason Blair, even as evidence mounted that he had fabricated quotes, fabricated entire stories, fabricated the people in the stories. The Times defended Judith Miller during the Iraq weapons of mass destruction disaster, time and time again. It's not going to fire Maggie Haberman, even though Michael Cohen testified under oath that he asked Haberman to write nice things about him, and Michael Cohen testified under oath that surreptitiously he recorded lots of conversations, including about 40 with reporters, and he played one of the recordings of somebody to Haberman for a story. And by the way, Haberman is sitting out there in court covering the trial. The Times' problem is that every month or so now, there's another story about Maggie Haberman trying to walk that tightrope of being friendly with sources without being friendly to sources. Cohen actually denied that he gave her stories in exchange for good spin, but her own colleagues did not exactly help her out. Jonathan Swan of the New York Times wrote on Twitter X yesterday that those condemning Haberman for talking to Cohen were wrong. And as I said, obviously that's true. I'm defending Maggie Haberman. It's true, but talk about damning her with faint praise. Swan wrote, "Nowhere did Cohen say he succeeded in getting Maggie to write positive stories about Trump. And we've been shown exhibits in court of Trump attacking Maggie publicly," unquote. What do you mean, attempted murder? The problem is that quote, "Nowhere did Cohen say he succeeded in getting Maggie to write positive stories about Trump." Well, that makes you stop and think, has Maggie Haberman written positive stories about Trump in the Times? The answer is yes. And now you have to wonder why. And now, again, this is not the lead story. I want to get to Michael Cohen's testimony about important things, but I can't. I mean, how often do my exes come up in the news? Well, actually, rather a lot. As to Katy Tur, the problem is, as I noted here long ago, as far back as 2016, she was calling me from the campaign trail to defend Kellyanne Conway. And when the first book with her name on it came out, even though Katy had asked me to write it for her, and I had given her all the Trump research material I had for free, and we had, lived together for 3 years. And when we broke up, when I asked her to leave, I paid her rent for a year so she could stay in New York. The only mention of me in that book was as somebody who she had dated briefly in her 20s. And even that was part of another anecdote in which she defended Kellyanne Conway, which is the point. This didn't just happen recently. She's been, I guess, Stockholm syndromed after her terrible experience, and it was a terrible experience. Her life was repeatedly threatened on the Trump campaign trail in 2016. I mean, it's only days since Nancy Pelosi slammed her seriously as a Trump apologist. Her work covering this trial and other Trump stories has not been neutral. It has not been appropriate. What was actually said about her on the stand by Cohen, and we'll get the transcript sometime today, was damaging. The erroneous, exaggerated version would be disqualifying if it were true. Even not true, it may be disqualifying. And as pissed off by her and as ashamed of her as I have been and am, that exaggerated version is neither fair nor correct. In her case and in Haberman's, the bottom line is if there were to be a sourced story, an investigative story with off-the-record sources, a Watergate-style source story that would actually break Trump, that would cause him to end his campaign today and flee the country, where do you think that story would come from? From somebody around Trump talking to somebody at the New York Times that the Michael Cohens of this world hated or did not know? Somebody who used to work on the sports desk before they eliminated sports at the New York Times? Or would it come from somebody they liked, like Maggie Haberman? I mean, Deep Throat, after all the Sturm und Drang of trying to figure out who Deep Throat was in the Watergate story, Bob Woodward's primary source, who set him off on half of the stuff he found about Watergate and confirmed the other half, he was the deputy director of the FBI. People are saying you can't have Maggie Haberman talking to Michael Cohen, would have been saying you can't have Bob Woodward talking to Mark Felt. So what do you do? Do you have somebody else other than Maggie Haberman cover this trial? Somebody else cover Trump? Do you fire Chris Cuomo? I mean, he has the largest audience on News Nation, which means 2 episodes of this podcast gets a combined audience that's about 43% larger than 1 episode of his TV show, which is not good. The problem for Katy, her own failures plus this unfairly amplified perception is bad. For her own good, for the network's own good, MSNBC has got to do this. Get her out of a position. Get her out of the time slot where she is anchoring live Trump coverage of any kind. To continue to throw her out there is professionally suicidal, and the end result of it will be something real that resembles what wasn't true yesterday, that on top of everything else put me in the position of defending her. Okay, now the actual lead. The case against Trump did not collapse yesterday. Michael Cohen was not proven to be a liar. Hard as the networks tried to make it happen, no, sorry. And boy, did CNN try hard. Anderson Cooper lost his spit. But a lawyer screaming liar does not make it so, especially if he's screaming liar at another lawyer. The Washington Post got it pitch perfect. I bash them all the time, too. The central witness against Donald Trump withstood a withering cross-examination Thursday from the former president's defense lawyer, who accused Michael Cohen of lying as recently as 2 days ago to realize his dreams of revenge against his ex-boss. 11 paragraphs later, the angriest and potentially most consequential moment in Thursday's testimony came when Todd Blanche confronted Cohen over his claim that he spoke to Trump on the evening of October 24th, 2016, when he called the phone of Trump's security chief, Keith Schiller. Cohen testified Tuesday that during the phone call, he told Trump the plan to pay hush money to Daniels was moving forward. Blanche, however, presented text messages between Schiller and Cohen that preceded that call and suggested an entirely different reason for the conversation. In those texts, the Washington Post writes, Cohen complained about getting harassing phone calls and asked for Schiller's help. "Call me," Schiller replied. After hours of mild-mannered and patient questioning of Cohen, Blanche erupted as he confronted Cohen over the Schiller texts. Accusing Cohen of fabricating key evidence against his client, the lawyer angrily grabbed the microphone and raised his voice. "That was a lie. You did not talk to President Trump that night," Blanche bellowed. Paragraph 12. as opposed to what the TV networks did, which was lead with this. Blanche suggested the call was simply too short for it to have included Schiller handing his phone to his boss so he and Cohen could discuss a financial transaction that would ultimately be the genesis of criminal charges against Trump, unquote. Well, the last part is nonsense. I once fired a manager and an agent in one phone call that, including the pleasantries and the goodbye, lasted a total of 36 seconds. What matters is trial resumes Monday. I mean, it's off now, right? We're all going to Barron's commencement tomorrow, aren't we? You got your invitation? You didn't? That's funny, I didn't either. Cross-examination of Cohen will be followed Monday by what the prosecutors said would be maybe 1 hour of redirect. CNN said the jury's going to spend the weekend thinking only of Blanche screaming, having proven he's a liar. No, he just said he was a liar. The prosecutors, nobody noticed, will spend the weekend thinking of how to undo whatever scuffing Cohen got yesterday. And by the way, if they've already planned out that they're going to need only about an hour more in redirect, they know what they're going to say. They know how they're going to the degree it's necessary, rehabilitate Michael Cohen. And the key point was the key point that the Washington Post made, and all the networks had made this the day before yesterday, but forgot it somehow yesterday. How would Cohen respond when this inevitably happened, that he was called a liar by Trump's lawyer, and he responded calmly and succinctly? He won. He was not destroyed. So they'll spend the weekend trying to finalize what to ask him about. And by the way, they'll talk about it in advance. And then, oops, maybe Trump testifies before this thing closes down. Nothing could help the prosecution more. If you are a praying person, pray that Trump testifies, because he'll say something under oath that will be a lie, and they can open up another prosecution of him. The final arguments will be early as Tuesday. The other headlines from the court: the daily visit from the unwashed and the unloved included Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert. If I am ever on trial for anything, please ask them to stay the F home. Boebert skipped her own son's criminal hearing to go to New York and grandstand to give Trump a hand, as it were. And what happened to Lauren Boebert? She was shouted down by the crowd of onlookers during the news conference that Gaetz and she and the others held. Jeering crowds as the other members of Congress walked away from the microphones, leaving her standing there by herself in all her 3-foot 8-inch glory. And what did the jeering crowds chant in the background? Beetlejuice. What's the reference to Beetlejuice? Oh, the play she was at with the guy during the Gropathon. Let's hear it for the boy. Let's give the boy a hand. Beetlejuice.
And I want all of the news to start asking the question, what is the crime? Because everyone in this court has not been informed of what the crime is. The defendant does not know the crime that was committed.
I thought no crowds were allowed near the courtroom. I thought the millions of people protesting were being held back by every police officer east of, I don't know, that theater that she saw Beetlejuice in. I thought, well, no, guess not. Meanwhile, Gaetz, a scumbag, went very dark. He tweeted a photo of himself standing behind Trump, and it reads, "Standing back and standing by, Mr. President." Oh, that's very funny, Matt. Associating yourself with fascist, racist militias. Well, a confession is good for the soul, isn't it? Once again, not too smart. Also, if that were not enough of a confession, again, the first thing these guys do when they get in front of a microphone is confess that this is an operation in which they say what Trump has been told not to say, and they have implicated themselves in a plot to violate the gag order, for which only Trump will be punished. Justice Merchan has got to get these hangers-on to testify about what Gaetz says right here.
We're here of our own volition because there are things we can say that President Trump is unjustly not allowed to say.
And then there was the saddest moment, as reported by Norm Eisen of the Brookings Institution. Jeffrey Clark, the environmental lawyer who almost made himself the Attorney General of the United States in the waning days of the Trump dictatorship, who was the one willing to use the Department of Justice to seize all the ballot boxes and all of the results, was, per Norm Eisen, Trump Fulton County criminal co-defendant and accused coup plotter Jeffrey Clark, sitting in back row, must have snuck in after lunch, stands up to be seen by Trump on way out, ignored. Never mind the testimony about Katy Tur. I would have paid money to see that, because then you turn to Jeffrey Clark and you say, sorry, pal, that's why there's an Insurrection Act. Okay, my voice is feeling a little bit better. I'm going to give you three other headlines, two of which totally damning about the Supreme Court, unless you've been paying attention. New York Times says that after the election in 2020, while many Trump supporters were claiming that Biden had stolen the presidency, they used the upside-down American flag, the sign of distress, as a Stop the Steal logo. So the sign of distress that has always been represented by flying the flag upside down was appropriated by these scumbag anti-democracy Republicans, and they would hang their flags upside down at their homes or wherever they had a flag. The Times reports one of the homes flying an inverted flag during that time was the residence of Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. in Alexandria, Virginia. According to photographs and interviews with neighbors, aloft on January 17th. Unbelievable. Biden's inauguration was 3 days away. Alarmed neighbors snapped photographs, some of which were recently obtained by the New York Times. Word of the flag filtered back to the court, people who worked there said in interviews. While the flag was up, the Times notes, matter-of-factly, the court was still contending with whether to hear a 2020 election case with Justice Alito on the losing end of that decision. So how did Alito reply to the fact that they were flying their freak flag at the Alito household? He used the Bob Menendez maneuver. I don't know anything about it. Talk to Mrs. Justice Alito. Quote, I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs. Well, we know, Alito, that personally insulting language on yard signs could have been congratulations, President-elect Biden. Alito's nuts. We know he's a fascist. We know he's a theocratic fascist. We know he's an utterly devoid of morals fascist, but he's also just nuts. Of course Alito won't resign, and there is no legal way to get him off the court. But if you have any doubts who he is or what he will do when the time comes, you can erase them now. Because one of two things is true. Either he put that flag upside down, or for what appears to be a period of at least a week, he didn't know that the flag outside the front door of his own house was upside down. Also, the missus should probably divorce him now. And I know this is low for the daily ration of Supreme Court sucks stories. There's another one. The Department of Justice really does need to take the lead here. I know that's a ridiculous statement to make, too. These are all theoreticals. These are all hopes. But it needs to open an investigation, a criminal investigation into Clarence Thomas. From the New Republic, Thomas is still refusing to reveal whether he repaid the principal on the $267,000 loan that he received from Anthony Welters, a wealthy healthcare executive. Welters. and a personal friend to purchase his RV in 1999, according to a letter that Senators Ron Wyden and Sheldon Whitehouse have sent to an attorney for Justice Thomas. But he's not corrupt. He's just getting what he deserves. And a little levity at the end, the quote of the day, the debates. Oh, yeah, the debates. Remember the story about the debates? That's so yesterday. Kayleigh McEnany on Fox. At the debates, Trump will stick to the issues. Trump, Kayleigh McEnany says, will be disciplined. Trump will be disciplined, you say? Presumably with one of Stormy Daniels' rolled-up magazines? Also of interest here, the man who defines journalism, the quintessence of ethics, the modern Edward R. Murrow and Richard Harding Davis combined. He has issued something out of Citizen Kane's finest moment, the statement of principles for the front page, a mission statement, how to report, how to be a reporter, how to write responsibly. Perhaps this will refresh your memory, Maggie Haberman. A mission statement has been crafted by the man most qualified to do it in the entire journalistic world, Chris Cillizza. But Chris, her emails. I'll read this unbelievable document to you. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Postscripts to the news. Some headlines, some updates, some snark, some predictions. Dateline Washington, D of C. This just in, Chris Cillizza has issued a mission statement. No. Mission, not e-mission. I don't know how many times I've talked about Chris Cillizza, who used to be, when he worked for the Washington Post, a semi-regular on Countdown on MSNBC. And then he developed an unfortunate habit of both-sidesing everything except stuff that didn't really matter. No one reporter is responsible for but her emails. The obsession with the story, which we think of as 2016, but actually started in 2015 and went on for more than a year, that moment of obsession, which may yet be the official start of the day that American democracy caught its fatal illness, that doesn't owe to one guy being a bad reporter or just not understanding what it was he was supposed to do or how he was supposed to evaluate truth from falsehood. Simply because both of those things was said by people wearing ties didn't mean you had to give equal balance to them. It owes in a larger sense to a combination of decreasing training and decreasing intelligence among reporters, because I don't know how many more good reporters there are now than there were in 1970, but the number of outlets that can give them prominence is about 10 times as large. For all of the contractions in the news industry, and there have been so many great news organizations that have gone right out the window and under the bus and into the toilet and all the other cliches you want to use, for every one that's gone out of business, there's been 100 new ones, and they've all been crap. But they do give jobs, or at least platforms, to people, and one of them was Chris Cillizza. And in addition to sort of overall stupidity in the news media that's gradually taken over in the last 50 years, the second part is FOMO, fear of missing out on somebody else's story. If you look at someone else's newspaper, newscasts, podcast, Twitter feed, and there's something on there that you have not emphasized and they have, and they're all excited about it, your instant reaction is to get excited about it too. I look at it and go, this is not interesting, sorry. That's unfortunately not what most of them do. And when they write the history, if after but her emails there is any history and anybody is allowed to write it, the book that comes out about but her emails may very well have Chris Cillizza's picture on it. Just in the middle 6 months of the year 2015, just in those 6 months, he wrote 50 different pieces and blog entries and articles for the Washington Post on her emails, Hillary Clinton's emails. And the headlines, and again, he may or may not have composed these, blog posts are different than newspaper articles. You can always depend on the idea that a newspaper article headline was not written by the person who wrote the article, but that's not necessarily true on a blog post. Every blog post I ever wrote, I wrote my own headlines. And these were just some of the headlines in that segment that he did for the Washington Post called The Fix, between March and I guess September of 2015. You ready? March 3rd, The Fix. Hillary Clinton's private email address at State reinforces everything people don't like about her. March 4th, the Hillary Clinton email story just keeps getting worse for her. August 12th, this email story just keeps getting worse for Hillary Clinton. And you'll notice that's the same thing he said the previous time, only with the words in different order. Then, let's see, this is August 9th. Hillary Clinton's email problem isn't going away. August 11th, Hillary Clinton email issue is not going away anytime soon. September 14th, Hillary Clinton's email issues have become a massive political problem. July 30th, Hillary Clinton as honest and trustworthy as Donald Trump. April 28th, Hillary Clinton has answered 7 questions as a candidate. Here are 7 more she should answer. But of course, I'm only scratching the surface here because it's a podcast and the amount of time I have available to me is infinity. It's kind of majestic when you read the headlines together like that, when you look at the big picture. It's like that scene in the movie The Right Stuff about the founding of the American space program, where they set up and lift off trial rocket after trial rocket, and they all collapse. Some of them get like 3 feet off the pad and then implode upon themselves, and they show the reflections of everything going up in flames and the eyeglasses of the scientists behind it. And Werner von Braun looks very unhappy. And machine after machine blows up in the air on the launch pad while they're carrying it out, while they're drawing it. The drawing blows up. It's like that. Looking at those emails, especially ones like the Hillary Clinton email story just keeps getting worse for her, followed by this email story just keeps getting worse for Hillary Clinton, followed by Hillary Clinton's email problem isn't going away. Anyway, the man who was behind all that, Chris Cillizza, who eventually left the Washington Post to go to work for CNN, only to get fired there, and has been independent ever since, has now issued a mission statement. And this is the crux of what I want to talk about here. He wrote this apparently about a week ago. I only saw it yesterday, so it's news to me because this Chris Cillizza mission statement story isn't going away. I watched Jerry Maguire over the weekend. That's another movie, and I know I make too many movie references, but at least the ones that I refer to don't suck. I refer to The Right Stuff. He's watching Jerry Maguire over the weekend with my wife and kids. It's a little cheesier than I remember. Okay, a lot cheesier. Something that's often said about Chris's work. But one thing stuck with me, Jerry's mission statement. A vision of what he wanted to do and why, how he could be different and better. So I wrote my own on journalism. Now, before you say this must be fiction, let me read it to you. Bullet point. I will hold politicians to account when they lie, when they obfuscate, or when they try to play too cute with their words or their actions. I will be tough but fair on Donald Trump. I will be tough but fair on Joe Biden. I will not conclude that something is good solely because Democrats do it, or something is bad solely because Republicans do it, or vice versa. I will never write things for clicks or to add subscribers who want red meat thrown at them. I will always show my work and how I got to my conclusions. I will admit when I got it wrong and explain how and why it happened. I will never talk down to you or assume I know better. I will always work to foster kindness and civility in our community. No. None of this is meant ironically. Anyway, that's the short version. Well, I've gotten a hold of the long version. It has all that, and then it goes on to say, I will not hold politicians to account when they lie. I will not be tough or fair with Donald Trump. I will not be tough or fair with Joe Biden. I will conclude that something is good solely because Democrats do it. I will always write things for clicks. I will never admit when I got it wrong. I will always talk down to you and assume I know better. You see what I did there? He's both sidesist. So the first half of his mission statement would consist of all those noble statements, but my satirical second half, in that he would contradict all those noble statements. See what I did there? This caused me to text a couple of my old MSNBC colleagues with a variation of this basic message. Remind me why we used to book this guy on the show. Did he drive himself into the office? Did he bring the crew food? Instead, I was reminded that the stuff from, I remember in 2006, 7, 8, as I said here once, when we used to have real trouble getting guests on MSNBC, Chris Cillizza was always ready to go. Probably brought food to the crew. It wasn't just then, or with the email stuff. It's keeping in pace to this day. I was reminded by somebody that during the Super Bowl, remember the RFK Jr. ad? Where they stole his uncle's 1960 presidential campaign ad word for word and had him voice it. Only, of course, it sounds like a frog that's been kidnapped and being held for ransom. They spent $15 million on it, but of course he had nothing to do with it. It was done by an outside group. There was no coordination. He put it at the head of his Twitter feed. He pinned it. So the FCC got involved, or FEC got involved. And the family, the Kennedys, denounced him. Right after it aired during the Super Bowl, somebody had tweeted, the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ad was brilliant, and Chris Cillizza saw that about this commercial that the world would condemn within minutes, and he got there first and retweeted it and added, quote, totally agree. Hillary Clinton as honest and trustworthy as Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton has answered 7 questions as a candidate. Here are 7 more she should answer. There is nothing out there that Chris Cillizza cannot get wrong or get right and then correct himself so he remains wrong, or get wrong and right, or get right and then correct it and then correct the correction so he winds up being wrong 75% of the time. He insisted that the models said Trump had not even the slightest chance of re-election. He wrote this at the end of September 2020. The models must have been Zoolander and Gisele Bündchen. He predicted a Republican red wave weeks before the 2022 midterms. He said that when she would not put Jim Jordan and Jim Banks on it, Nancy Pelosi, let me get the exact quote, doomed the already tiny chances of the January 6th committee actually mattering. And then the first time we mentioned him here in this podcast, November of 2022, the House Majority Whip, Jim Clyburn, South Carolina, history degree from South Carolina State, history teacher in high school, said on Fox, the facts are very clear. I've studied history all of my life. I've taught history, and I'm telling you what I see here are parallels to what the history was in this world back in the 1930s in Germany and in Italy. And Chris Cillizza knew better than Jim Clyburn, because Chris Cillizza is a very serious political reporter. I mean, look at all the extensive coverage he did of the Hillary Clinton email story and how decisive that was in the election. That proves he was right? Also, he hosts Political Trivia Night, and he went to Georgetown. Chris Cillizza wrote after Jim Clyburn said, hey, this looks like Nazi Germany like in 1932, so pre-Nazi Germany or Italy before Mussolini started wearing the uniform and killing people. Chris Cillizza wrote less than a year and a half ago, I guess about a year and a half ago, rule number 1 of politics goes like this: don't compare anything to Nazi Germany. Just don't. Before we go any further, It's worth noting here that comparing anything to the Nazi regime, which led to the systemic murder of more than 6 million Jews, is a mistake. It just is. There is nothing in our current moment that suggests we are anywhere close to that. Well, of course, the whole point of what Clyburn was saying was he was not comparing Hitler to the current moment of November 2022. He was comparing it to our immediate future. He was comparing the Hitler of 1930 to our America of 2022 and thus of 2024. What is ahead for us? What I see here are parallels to what the history was in this world back in the 1930s in Germany, in Italy. He didn't mention the Nazis. Chris Cillizza did. Then at about the same time, there was this tweet that went out. America needs a total cleansing only Trump can do with the help of true patriots. Herschel Walker sent that. It was in response to the nutjob lawyer Lynn Wood, who had tweeted calling for the execution of Mike Pence by a firing squad in November 2022. The response from Chris Cillizza to that was the election deniers like Herschel Total Cleansing of America Walker, quote, represent a serious threat to our way of life. After all, if we can't accept that our leaders were fairly elected and have faith in the system, it's very hard to imagine how we can expect anyone to effectively govern. That's what would be wrong with a fascist coup to overturn a democratic election and install a loser as winner and do heaven knows what to the actual elected president. That's the problem there. It would interfere with governance. The lines at the Department of Motor Vehicles would quadruple if there were a civil war going on or a coup, or if there were tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue and Chris Cillizza was at the DMZ. Imagine the inconvenience for Americans trying to report for jury duty. Now, I'm not going to say Cillizza ignored the idea that there might be a fascist coup. He did address this. Another fascist coup? Which is bad! Exclamation point. Very bad! See, you know it's more important because he used it very on the second reference. But it's also worth remembering that democracy held in 2020, even while it was under active assault from Donald Trump and his minions. Again, the man who helped bring you her emails is saying, what do you mean, attempted murder? He's not dead, is he? Quote, we absolutely should be vigilant about the potential rise of authoritarian politicians who would wipe out things like the rule of law to further their own political ambitions. But let's stop making the Nazi Germany comparisons for all of our sakes. Politicians who would wipe out things like the rule of law, because there's lots of other things they could do that would have as much damage as wiping out the rule of law. Again, tanks blocking Chris's way into the DMV. That would really be a tragedy. I mean, what would happen if he was going back to the world's only remaining blockbuster with that copy of Jerry Maguire that he'd watched with his wife and kids and found it a little bit cornier? What if he was trying to return it and they were cooing out there in the street and he couldn't return the VHS? I mean, it's probably the only VHS copy. What if it got damaged? What if they shot up his car and, nobody was hurt, but the VHS copy, the videotape of Jerry Maguire were the last living copy of Jerry Maguire? I mean, isn't anybody going to think of Tom Cruise? Won't somebody think about Tom Cruise's work gone forever because of this coup? I mean, this is what we have to worry about. Politicians who would wipe out things like the last copy of Jerry Maguire. But let's stop making the Nazi Germany comparison for all of our sakes, even though Trump keeps quoting Hitler, even though Trump kept a copy of Hitler's speeches by his bed. The next day after Cillizza wrote that, Elon Musk told his 115 million followers to vote Republican, and then responded to a quote that was falsely attributed to Voltaire that was actually spoken by an American neo-Nazi pedophile. And the day after that, Musk tweeted a photo of a Nazi soldier from 1940. Chris Cillizza. mission statement. Hillary Clinton finally apologizes for her private email server. What took so long? September 8th, 2015. Hillary Clinton's apology interview annotated. September 9th, 2015. Hillary Clinton's worst week in Washington. August 21st, 2015. Now, you know what? The whole 52, 56, 60-week stretch from about that headline through November of 2016, those are all tied for Hillary Clinton's worst week in Washington. And in fact, those are all tied for, to that point, America's worst week in Washington. And people like Chris Cillizza are responsible for it, and never in their lives will they ever understand this. If you could actually claim that your mission statement should include, I will never write things for clicks or to add subscribers who want red meat thrown at them. I will always show my work and how I got to my conclusions. I will admit when I got it wrong and explain how and why it happened. Chris Cillizza, literally 9 years after he was as wrong as anybody in American journalism could be wrong, doesn't even know that this is where he was wrong and will not admit that he got it wrong and cannot explain how and why it happened because he doesn't believe he got it wrong. I will never talk down to you or assume I know better, except for these 50 articles about Hillary Clinton's emails in just that 6-month period. That's not even the whole list. So, reading all this, I was thinking about asking Chris Cillizza for a comment to put in this podcast about how these stories, Hillary Clinton finally apologizes for her private email server. What took so long? And the upcoming looking back at the 10-year anniversary of Hillary Clinton's email servers. My best 57 articles on Hillary Clinton emails. I thought, I could ask him about that. I was thinking of sending him an email. What do you think? To the number one story on the countdown, and it's Friday and the weekend edition, so that means a little more James Thurber for you. James Thurber had many full-time jobs. He was a street reporter for the Columbus Dispatch and later the New York Post, and he was an editor of the New Yorker long before he was a writer or cartoonist there. And people kept trying to make him into a radio star, leading to a short story which is, understandably, one of my favorites. A lot of it speaks of broadcasting in another world and, of course, another century. But it is amazing how much of what you will hear now is still true today. From the May 5th, 1934 edition of the New Yorker, How to Relax While Broadcasting by James Thurber. The evening I went up to the studios for my first radio broadcast, I got off by mistake at the 16th floor instead of the 17th. I decided not to wait for the elevator, but just run up the stairs to the 17th floor because elevators in broadcasting buildings are always crowded with small Italian musicians carrying cellos. And furthermore, when the up sign above the elevators in these buildings lights, the operator of the car that stops for you usually says, "Down!" And before you can think, you find yourself on the first floor again without any way of getting back up because you surrendered your pass to the man at the desk in the lobby the first time you went up. I walked to a door on the 16th floor marked stairs and stepped out into a cold, dark staircase shaft and walked up one flight. I found that the door on that floor wouldn't open. It was after 7 o'clock in the evening and the door had been officially locked. I hurried back down to the 16th floor and discovered that the door there had locked behind me too. I began to beat on it and kick it. From far off, a faint voice came to me finally saying, "Cut that out!" The only thing to do was walk down 15 flights to the main floor, which I did, but the door out into the lobby was also locked, and nobody answered my screams and poundings. Screaming and pounding is not radio, as the broadcasting people say. I went down into the basement, which was dark and gloomy, and hunted for the elevator shaft. I found it, but there was no bell to push, so I sat on an old chair until the car came down. The operator was surprised to see me and asked me for my pass. I told him I didn't have a pass. He thought a while and then asked if Mr. Heyman knew I was down there. I said I didn't think so. He was pretty much alarmed by that, but he took me up to the 17th floor after warning me never to come down to the basement again without a pass. There was nobody on the 17th floor who understood my case, although the people I talked to were patient and courteous. They said the 17th floor was entirely given over to the business department and had no studios or microphones. What I probably wanted was the 27th floor. Up there, I found some people I had met before, but they were pretty busy and seemed to think it was the wrong night. I sat down in a chair, and presently a man came up to me and asked me if I was Mr. Totherer. I said I wasn't sure, and he said to follow him. I was shown into an office where there were some officials I knew and some friends of mine. One of the officials was denying a story somebody had been telling about a man who fell dead in front of the microphone. It seems he had merely had a stroke. In a little while, I was led in a solemn march to a small and lonely studio, heavily draped and silent. I took out a cigarette but saw a sign saying no smoking, so I put the cigarette away again. Some men in the glassed-in control room began to look at me. I could see their lips move, but I couldn't hear anything. A man tiptoed into the room where I was and shook hands with me and tiptoed out again. He never came back. I walked over to a regular microphone, such as I had talked over once or twice before and had got used to, but somebody led me away from that, said I was to talk over a table microphone because it would help me to relax. This turned out to be a table about the size of a card table with a microphone set innocently in its center, face up, more or less like an ashtray. Its studied simplicity caused me to tighten up slightly, and I mentioned this to a man. "Be at your ease," he said. I stood over the table, grasped its edges firmly, and leaned down toward the microphone. Someone grasped me. No, he said. You just sit down at the table as if you were sitting in a chair at any table and talk. I sat down, trying to remember how I sit in a chair at a table, especially a card table at which nobody else is sitting. "Relax," said someone with a note of command. I slumped back in the chair and placed on the table the papers I was going to use and began fussing with them. "Shh," somebody hissed. "Don't rustle them. This is a very highly sensitized mic, which picks up every slightest sound. It would sound like a waterfall if you rustled them." I began to drum my fingers on the tabletop, but a courteous official put his hand on mine and stopped that. "Tapping would sound like cavalry crossing a bridge to your listeners," he explained. "Just take it easy." I leaned back in my chair and adjusted my tie, doubtless giving the effect of someone trying to take a leather belt away from a bulldog. In a moment, an announcer came in and said we were all ready to go. "Okay," I said, standing up, "let's get out." He smiled with calm assurance and said no, he meant that we were about to start the program. Everybody but him tiptoed out of the room. I sat down at the table again. I could see them all watching me from the control room. Somebody in there raised his hand sharply and let it drop sharply. I expected to hear the faint hiss of lethal gas escaping into the chamber, but instead the announcer started to talk. I creaked nervously in the chair at this, and the listeners heard, along with his calm announcement, the sound of a buckboard falling over a cliff. Finally, he pointed a finger at me. I sat bolt up and began to talk to the ashtray. When it was all over, everybody tiptoed whisperingly into the room and congratulated me on being only 5 seconds too slow. Not bad for a beginner. The record is 1/500th of a second. I got up and started out of the room, but a man followed me and took me by the arm. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Let's all go out and get a drink," I said. But you haven't got time, he said. All this has just been the rehearsal. I must have tightened up horribly at that, for he said soothingly, take it easy. You got plenty of time to relax in. He looked at his wristwatch. You got 4 minutes. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled the orchestration and the keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. ESPN. How could you misspell ESPN or mispronounce it? It's spelled very similarly to the way it sounds. ESPN. ESPN. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever, and our announcer today was my friend Nancy Faust. Everything else pretty much my fault, as usual. That's Countdown for this, the 173rd day until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,228th day since dictator J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the legal system, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if the Supreme Court makes it up, use the not regularly given elector objection option to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. The throat may be on the mend. The sinus infection may be on the run. Hopefully I'll be at 75% by then. Whenever the next one is, till the next one, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and what about her emails?